Thank you very much. Hello, my name's Akhil Ahmed. I'm a broadcaster and on the board of the Bradford Literature Festival. And today I'm going to be having a conversation with my good friend here, Said Khan. Said is, if you have a look in the bio, you can see so much about him, but obviously he's a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan. And he's also the co-founder of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and a panelist on Turning Point for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He's also somebody I know from when I'm doing a lot of my work outside. If I've got any kind of hole and I need somebody who's got the kind of knowledge, he somehow has the knowledge about everything. So today, Said is going to talk us through the whole story around the annexation of the Punjab 175 years on and what it means. And so the first thing I'm going to do is throw out to you, Said, and say, where do you want to start?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you all for spending your Sunday mornings with us. The bio is a little bit old. Actually, I got promoted to being an associate professor, so that's kind of good.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you much. No increase in pay. I mean, ironic that we're here at the university. I'm sure the walls can speak here. Well, one of the things that as historians we do is we always hit the rewind button. We don't start with what happened 175 years ago because we like to get a running start to see what happened and to provide some context. And I guess the first thing we have to ask is, does anyone know what a rewind button is anymore?
Where'd you rewind to?
Yeah, well, with streaming, I mean, you don't get that chance, you know. I mean, once upon a time there were cassette decks and CDs, and we used to hit the rewind with that. But looking at the situation of India, such a rich history. And I know for some of you, you might be very familiar with, of course, that moment of independence in 1947, and perhaps even more personally for some, the pain and the trauma of partition. But when we take a look at what was happening in the Punjab in around the middle of the 19th century, there was so much going on with India and really with Great Britain at the time. And I know that the curriculum in British schools also is almost criminally absent of so much of this. Today, as somebody who teaches global studies, you know, we're trained to look at things in a macro level, almost like concentric circles going out. And if you take a look at what was happening with India, you can place it within these broader contexts. Like, for example, coming from the United States, we have that little thing that we're going to be celebrating, which apparently you won't. You've decided on that very day you're going to have an election, July the 4th, that this is the War of Independence. But the War of Independence also has a context to the British and the French. A few years before that, there was what was known as the French-Indian War, or what's known as the 7 Years' War, which actually had to do with the British and the French in India. For example, some of you might know that the revolution started when a bunch of colonial people in America decided that they did not want to have taxation without representation. They were quite upset at the Stamp Act, and so they started dumping tea into Boston Harbor. Well, that tea was brought to America by way of the British East India Company. And the British East India Company in the middle of the 18th century was the dominant British force there, about, I'd say, 8 years before the Raj takes over. And I think that's an important place for us to start. Some of you are familiar, of course, with the great historian William Dalrymple, and he has written extensively about India in many books, including The Last Mughal and The White Mughal. But one of his more recent books is The Anarchy, and some of you might remember seeing him here at the festival. I think it was probably 2 years ago now, where he was talking about this book. The reason I raise this is because the British East India Company was really the world's first corporation, other than the Catholic Church. Anyway, but the fact that you have now corporate interests coming in, changing the global economy, changing the global political structure, I think is very important, and in many ways helps contextualize what was happening in India to what's happening now. Anyways, that brings the British East India Company into our discussion here. And even though it was a private corporation, it had one of the largest armies in the world, and it had made its stretch across India arriving at the very doorstep of the Punjab. Now, at this time, the ruler of the Punjab was Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And someone showed him a map of India and showed the fact of where the British East India Company's territory was and control. And it was all red, getting up to the line of a river, the Satluj River, which was sort of a de facto border between the British East India Company and the Punjab. And he very famously said, "Ab ye sara lal hone wala hai," which translation, this is all going to become red. And it seems as though it was quite prophetic, because he realized that the British East India Company wasn't going to stop at the water's edge, but was then going to move forward. So he then realizes, if you can't beat them, maybe you need to join them, and if you can't join them, at least placate them. So he then enters into a rather uneasy friendship with them, gives them a little bit of land, and tries to essentially buy their peace. He realized that on the other side of the Punjab was really where the British interest also was, and that was in Afghanistan and further into Central Asia. Why? Because the other big empire that was around was Russia. And so this part of Central Asia then is a battleground between Russia and the British. Of course, the Russians can claim this is our home. The British are the ones who are sort of in the wrong neighborhood. And this then makes the battleground around the Sikhs. Now, Ranjit Singh then realizes that he doesn't really trust the British very much, but he also doesn't trust the Afghans to stay quiet either, and so he builds up his army. Now, that doesn't go unnoticed by the British. They will go ahead and say, is he really doing this just to be defensive vis-a-vis the Afghans, or is he on to us? And so there's a little bit of tension that's going on there.
How long does this go on for then?
So this is going on in the 1840s, around 1845 to 1846, and as oftentimes happens with wars, diplomacy and communication breaks down. And these tensions then turn to provocations, and the provocations then lead to what is known as the First Anglo-Sikh War, which goes on from about December of 1845 to about March of 1846. So not a very long campaign, and of course you notice that it's being fought in the winter in India, because it would be a little bit too hot for the British East India Company to be fighting it if it's in the summer. Now, Ranjit Singh had gone ahead and actually hired American and European mercenaries to help train his soldiers, but he'd also conscripted Hindus and Muslims in there, saying, look, the British aren't anybody's friends, so we ought to really go ahead and come together. And I think that this word "we" becomes very, very important, because it's contested in so many ways as to who is we at any one time.
Is that the first time that all the different groups are coming together to take on the British? Or?
So this is the problem, that there were so many conflicts that were going on in India, even leading up to this, that you couldn't necessarily presume that everybody from a particular religion was going to be on the same side.
Exactly.
And the most famous of this is, of course, the Battle of Plassey in 1797 with Lord Clive. That then, of course, leads to the conflict with Mysore and Tipu Sultan, who, as I think some of you might know, Tipu Sultan was betrayed by other Muslim regimes to his downfall. By the way, side story on this, getting back into the whole thing about the British and the French. So the French, of course, have no love lost for the Brits, and so they're looking for a way to scupper the British East India Company in India. So they form an alliance with Tipu Sultan. And in fact, as history now shows, it really didn't work very well. I'm not saying that as a slur to the French, at least not on this. But Napoleon, in his dealings with the French, then develops enough religious literacy about Islam that in 1798, he invades Egypt. Yeah. And when he gets to Cairo, it takes him 3 weeks to go from Alexandria down to Cairo after the Battle of Giza. And he goes to Al-Azhar, the premier Muslim seminary, and he tells everyone, "Nous sommes vrais musulmans." And by the way, pardon my French. And he is saying, we are all Muslims. Yeah. And they're like, who's we? Yeah. Well, he says, I support and venerate the Prophet Muhammad, as do you. And then he starts riffing quotes from the Quran and from the prophetic tradition. And I'm sure that the Al-Azhar scholars are like, mate, where did you learn this? That goes back to Tipu Sultan and his dealings with the Indians. Anyways, long story short on that. In 1839, Ranjit Singh dies, so before the First Anglo War. And this is where reality TV kicks in. Now that he is dead, there is a competition for the throne. The first person who goes for the throne is his illegitimate son. He is then imprisoned and he dies. There's suspicion that he is poisoned. Next comes another son who is actually an infant. So he is now going to have a regent ruling over the entire Sikh Empire, and that regent is his mother, Ranjit Singh's widow, who's in this. But you can just imagine the kind of ambition and the opportunism that's going on in the throne. And while this is going on, there's also a tension between the Sikh Sindhyawalas and the Hindu Dogras. So one of the ways that the problem is solved is to make the Hindu Dogra representative the prime minister. So on that question about collaboration and cooperation, I think it's very important to recognize here that these religious communities were actually rather elastic in the relationship that they had with one another. They weren't necessarily walking around, and of course you could tell who's a Sikh and who's a Hindu and who's a Muslim. But that kind of identity politics is different than how we should regard the identity politics of 2024. In fact, I would argue that the identity politics of 2024 are even different than the identity politics of 1974, where these lines were not so static. Anyways, you've got an expanded army that the Sikhs have, and you also have the invocation of religion. When the Anglo-Sikh War goes on, there is the invocation of saying that this is the fulfillment of Guru Gobind Singh's ideal of a Sikh commonwealth. So I think it's an important element to go ahead and consider, because when we think about the invocation of religion, that's usually something that is privileged to Christians with the Crusades, Muslims with jihad. But this is not a very uncommon trope to go ahead and galvanize people when it comes to religion. But it also doesn't exclude others to join as well. I mean, if you're wondering about Muslims and Hindus, it's like, well, you know, that's nice that Guru Gobind Singh wants to have a Sikh commonwealth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's antithetical to perhaps what we should be considering to go ahead and do. The problem for the Sikhs when it comes to the First Anglo-Sikh War is they've expanded the military, but there's no way to pay the military. And so now we have Sher Singh, who is the Maharaja. And, well, I guess this has to be said, the Maharajas really lived high on the hog. They had a very, very lavish lifestyle, and so that's where the money went instead of to the army. The army wasn't as strong. It was not as regimented. It didn't have as good a morale.
And the base at this point is what, in Lahore?
The base is in Lahore.
Yeah. So the place you're talking, my family grew up literally next door to the palace. And whenever you go there, they have steps, and the steps are not normal steps. The steps are steps for elephants, because the Maharaja would be moving around the palace on his elephant, which when you're a kid, it's kind of like that's got to be the coolest thing on the planet. But of course, the cost of maintaining all of this kind of lavish lifestyle when the British are encroaching must have been a difficult thing for the public as well to have to endure.
Well, and this is a thing that you can try to tell the public, well, we're in this together, we're going to have to tighten our purse strings, we're going to have to tighten our belt, because, of course, we have to worry about the British coming. And I think that the public would understand that, except that if you're still maintaining your lavish lifestyle, it doesn't really bode well for people. And so those notions of rationing and all of that becomes a very difficult sale to go ahead and make. Well, as all this intrigue is going on, the British East India Company is coming in really unfettered. And it would be probably a bit naive to say that they weren't looking to exploit the internal rumblings that were happening among the Sikhs. They come right up to the water's edge of the Sutlej River. Now the Sikhs of course, are seeing all of this is going on, and perhaps in some ways to go ahead and, as they would say, wag the dog or distract attention from rising public discontent, who are starting to ask those questions. Well, you know, you've got all your diamonds and all of your precious stones, and yet we don't have enough money. What's going on here? It's very easy then to go ahead and raise the alarm even higher and say, here come the British. At the same time, the Sikhs do cross the Sutlej River, and under the pretense, they say, of trying to fortify some of their land and territory on that side. And this is true. There was Sikh territory on the other side of the Sutlej. The British claim that this was purely an act of hostility and aggression that was threatening the British East India Company and their holdings that were there, particularly around the town of Firozpur. This is the great thing about being a historian, is that there isn't anything necessarily clear-cut. In some ways, when you're researching the archives, you have to almost play judge or jury, luckily not executioner, where you are seeing the narratives that are formed when it comes to how the British see this and how the Sikhs are seeing this. And quite honestly, given the day, I could go back and forth on that. I find it interesting, though, that if you were to speak to most Indians, they're going to go ahead and impute on the British perhaps the most unfavorable motivation, saying, oh, the Sikhs didn't pose a threat, the British were simply being opportunistic about that. And conversely, if you were to ask the Sikhs, they would say, hey, it was our land, the British were the ones who came right up there and they were taunting us and doing whatever. In any event, we find then that on December the 11th, the war starts. And by March, it doesn't go very well for the Sikhs. In fact, we find that the Treaty of Lahore finally then issues the terms of the surrender of the Sikh army. Among the things that they have to do are surrender an area called Jalandhar Doab. Another interesting point, the Sikh Confederation was known as the Sikh Misl, M-I-S-L. The Sikh administration had viziers, ministers, and Doab is actually also an Arabic word. And I think that this is an important thing to go ahead and consider, because given the religious tensions that people feel among the various religious communities of India, you would then wonder, well, wow, why are they using Arabic words? They were not impervious to, and they were not hostile to appropriating and embracing terminology from other ethnic groups, from other religious groups. Call it maybe a kind of misguided hope for ecumenism to come in the past. The most important thing that happens is twofold. One is that the British East India Company demands an indemnification of 15 million rupees. And the Sikhs can't pay this. So if you can't pay in money, you have to pay in land. And some of the land that the Sikhs then cede to the British include Kashmir, and they include Hazara, which is up near the Afghan regions, and a lot of the forts and a lot of the infrastructure there. And I think that this is important to go ahead and also recognize that when it comes to the transition and the exchange of territory, it wasn't just simply a matter of invasion, conquest, or a land grab. Some of these were negotiated as terms of surrender in treaties, and this was one of them. But the other, perhaps more damning consequence in the Treaty of Lahore is that the British seeped into interfering in the government processes of the Sikh Empire. And they were constantly micromanaging it, in part because they wanted to make sure that the Sikhs did not pose a threat to the interests of the British East India Company, in part so that the British East India Company could basically have a free rein to do whatever they wanted. But this, of course, doesn't go well with the public. And the simmering tension that occurs with the public then boils over in 2 more years with the Second Anglo-Sikh War. And this is a rebellion that begins in April of 1848 in Multan, up in the north of Punjab. By March the 12th of the following year, the war is over, and the Sikhs again have suffered a really crushing defeat. We find that 20,000 Sikhs surrender, including their leaders Sher Singh and Chattar Singh. And Sir Walter Gilbert is the British East India Company officer who accepts the surrender in Rawalpindi in modern-day Pakistan. It is at this point that the British also take the Khyber Pass. So when we hear all of the legends and lores about the Khyber Pass, included even in the 1975 movie, if you've seen it, with Michael Caine and Sean Connery, The Man Who Would Be King, they talk about the Khyber Pass. That happens at this time. Now, what's really fascinating about this is it's the Sikh defeat, but you have religious communities within the defeated areas that don't necessarily see the British victory as a defeat, including the Muslim community.
Why is that then?
Well, when the Muslims are in this area, they had to contend with the fact that the Sikhs had outlawed the call to prayer, or the adhan, being aired in public. The British come in and they re-allow it. Along with that, the British also go forth and reconstruct mosques that had either been desecrated by or had fallen into decay at the hands of the Sikhs. Now, of course, the question to be asked, was this the British being magnanimous, or was this the British being opportunistic to form a cleavage between the Sikh and the Muslim communities as a way of divide and rule, divide and conquer?
Well, the only reason I was going to ask on that one was, obviously you could probably go both ways depending on what you did in archive research. But one of the great things about the British Empire, although I know it's just prior to the technical term of British Empire, you would imagine that there would have been paperwork. They were very good at paperwork.
They had really good penmanship too, yeah.
Yeah, but would you not think that there'd be, is there no kind of information that gives, are there no kind of things that went back to the government or between people saying setting out what they could do, what you could spend money on, so that you would have a better idea about why they were doing some of these things?
That's a terrific question. But I certainly welcome anyone to go into the archives. You can go either to the British Library in London, or you can go to the National Archives at Kew.
Yeah.
Some of these documents might be in India. Some of them simply may not exist anymore. Either the rats got them, and when I say the rats, that's not a metaphor for anyone. I'm talking about rodents.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of these documents sometimes became fodder for animals. But also, as it's now been substantiated, the British in many places did destroy documents that would prove to be a little bit perhaps problematic. We saw this especially in British campaigns in East Africa with Kenya, especially around the time of the Mau Mau revolt. In the case, though, of documents, irrespective of whether or not they exist, one of the things that we find usually missing is intentionality. You will find numbers, you will find proclamations, you will find edicts, but you usually will not find in documents the motivations, what is behind it. And as a result of that leaves it for historians and others to have to fill in those blanks and perhaps make certain assumptions as to what then drove them to go ahead and do this.
Because the reason I asked that is because if you've got access to the Khyber Pass, because it's all part of the Great Game, right?
Yeah.
It's the war with the Russian bear,
Yeah.
as it were. If you've got access to the Khyber Pass, do you need to bother with the rest? South of that? So why do you? Or do you just if you're winning, you don't stop? I mean, what's the if as we said, that part of it, I'm just trying to, in terms of the chronology of it, if you've got to the Khyber Pass, so therefore you've got a corridor all the way to take on the Russians in Afghanistan, if and when, and also, of course, Afghanistan, stopping the Afghans from coming in and pillaging as well. So if you've got all of that, why would you need to take the rest?
That's a great question. So the Great Game was a strategy or a name given to the idea of European imperialism, European expansion, mainly because they saw the map of the world as a game board and who could get what. And there were really sub-games going on at the same time. The Great Game was world domination, but then you had regional domination going on, including what was known as the Eastern Question diplomacy. And the Eastern Question diplomacy dealt primarily with the Ottoman Empire. The French, the British, and the Russians all are gunning for it to be weakened and ultimately destroyed. But no one trusted the other two if they were the ones who were victorious, because it would completely shift the balance of power. And also, no one wanted the Ottoman Empire to simply implode because it would create a vortex or a power vacuum. And so as a result of it, you find these really interesting interventions that sometimes it's the British coming in on the side of the Ottoman Empire against the Russians and the
Crimea,
French. When in Crimea was a classic example, right? So you see these kinds of intrigues that are also going on. And so in many ways, the game board is changing underneath the pieces. In the case of why the British would want anything below it is why not, is a simple answer. And also, if you control that, you're controlling people, you're controlling territory, you're controlling resources, and you're also controlling access to the water. It's easier for you to then make a beeline straight north and get to the Arabian Sea than have to go all the way back to India and then find your way through there in order to get to navigable waters. So part of this was expediency, because unlike today, where most people might just simply put it on a cargo plane or an Amazon van, you had to ship goods everywhere, and there was no refrigeration. So the idea then of you getting goods to ship is in the, like say in the port of Karachi, is certainly going to save you a lot more time than if you have to go to, say, the port of Bombay in order to get there, because spoilage is real. And when everybody is paranoid about losing market share, this then becomes the obsession.
And at this point, as you said, you talk about market share. At this point, it's not really it's the East India Company. It's not the empire.
So the Second Anglo-Sikh War leads to then the seminal event, which then brings the Raj in, which is the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. The defeat of the Sikh army and really the empire in 1849 then leads to Lord Dalhousie declaring that the Punjab has been annexed by the British East India Company. In many ways then fulfilling the prophecy that Ranjit Singh had that the whole map would be red. Well, this then became a rallying cry for many to then go ahead and be recruited into armies, except that they were getting recruited into two different armies. One was the British East India Company, because they paid well, and also you wanted to be on the side of who were the alphas in the place. But at the same time, it also led to those who were getting ideas that maybe there's an alternate to go
joining the rebellion
to be had, and forming a kind of loose rebellion. As many of you know, in 1857, there was a mutiny from within the ranks of the British East India Company military. The apocryphal version is that the British East India Company introduced a new rifle, the .303 Enfield. And in it, you had these little packets that were issued. And so the packet came with gunpowder, and it came with the bullets. The BBs, in order to be really expeditious. And by the way, I don't use this if you're for self-defense. Get yourself, and I'm saying this as an American, a good old-fashioned assault weapon. It's faster. But if you were in the field, you had to tear open with your teeth the little packet, and then you put the gunpowder in. You kind of shoved it in, and then you put the bullets, and then you fired. Not exactly a fast way of doing things. So the British East India Company, allegedly, in order to make it faster to rip it open, they laced the string with animal fat, more specifically lard. Well, this then offended the Muslims in the army because it was a pork product, and it offended the Hindus because it was an animal product. And that is allegedly what then began the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, which was brutally clamped down. But at this time, the British East India Company also realized that this is a little bit above our pay grade, and they then implored the Crown to come in. And this is where you see the transition of India from being privately controlled by a British entity to now on the public trust. And by the way, I had people in my family tree who were involved in the mutiny, and in fact, they were killed. Yeah.
Right.
So
it's real.
It's very real. The ones who apparently weren't fit enough to be in the army which is my particular direct lineage, they migrated to Hyderabad afterwards. So basically, the good news is they survived, but it's because we're genetically inferior, I think, compared to the rest the more virile men who died in the Sepoy Mutiny. But it's a fascinating transition of power that happens.
And what changes them?
What changes whom?
Well, no, so what changes now then? So basically, obviously, there's been this transition. We've gone from a corporation to state control. How do people, what kind of changes do you start to see on the ground at this point?
Well, the first and most important change I would argue that you have is you have the full force of the British Royal Navy behind you. Now you have the full force of the Crown and all of those resources. So now you can be further dug in to the region. But there's also now a recognition, because of the experience in the Punjab, of how to deal with rebellions and how to then control areas. The British East India Company, for all of its issues, did understand how to negotiate at a very sophisticated level. Part of it was carrot, part of it was stick, but they were very effective in this. For the British coming in now as a Raj, they have to decide, how do you deal with the independent princely states? Do you use the kind of social control that the British East India Company did? Do you act in a more military way? Because after all, India was, contrary to how we might see it, a very heterogeneous area. But I think the experience that the British East India Company had in the Punjab and the way that they dealt with it really put down a template for this incoming administration of the Crown and how to deal with that.
So then what comes next then? Now they're in.
You mean the Raj?
Yeah.
Well, as they say, that, so the past is prologue for this. Well, I mean, the British see India now under the era of Victoria as the crown or the jewel in the crown. And I mean, to their credit, they really did see India as being what made Britain an empire.
Yeah.
And you see the kinds of social engineering that also start to occur. Part of it is an effort to secularize society, to make religious identity less important.
To enable them what? To rule?
To
better,
enable them to rule,
Yeah.
And again, I think in fairness, we can look at it from one of two different narratives. We can look at it as being something insidious, that they were purposely bringing in and fomenting discord and discontent in order to further justify not only their presence in the area as being the so-called neutral peacemakers and policemen, but also as a way to prolong their stay there. Or you can go ahead and also look at it from the standpoint that secularizing a society essentially goes ahead and flattens the topography. And for an empire that is so vast that the sun literally never set on it at this time, it made it more expedient for British administration to rule, saying, well, we're not going to get into all these distinctions of, what day is it? Is it Eid? Is it Guru Nanak's birthday? Is it Diwali? We're just going to take that out of the equation and everybody's the same. That we see as being more efficient. But we also have to realize that given how big and vast the empire was, the number of administrators in India was really only a few thousand. And they were now governing a population that by the time independence happened in 1947 was 400 million. That's grown slightly over the last nearly 80 years, mind you.
And once it becomes the Raj, are they taking more money out than the East India Company, and how does that operate? Because I presume they are, because I suppose the East India Company are still in the job of trying to make money as opposed to necessarily asset stripping.
Yeah, well then what ends up happening is the British East India Company ultimately sort of disbands. It becomes decentralized. So another person who's a good friend to the Bradford Literature Festival, someone you might have seen here, is the Indian Member of Parliament, Shashi Tharoor.
Yeah.
And Shashi is very prolific, both in his prose and in his publications. And one of the books that he's written is called Inglorious Empire. And in Inglorious Empire, along with perhaps, how many of you have read it by any chance? Excellent. How many of you've seen on YouTube, or if you were there, his Oxford Union debate? Yeah. So of course, one of the stellar statistics that he mentions is what was the position of India in the global economy before the British and after the British. Before the British really started taking, India was responsible for 27% of the global gross domestic product. 27%. So basically, for every 4 pounds that was generated by the world, 1 pound was generated by India alone. Yeah. And by the time 1947 came around, I think it had dropped down to something like 2%. So we see that that's a significant, I'll use the word taking, appropriation.
And I suppose once the annexation happens, and then the kind of like the consolidation comes along, and then we obviously then have the coronation of Queen Victoria, as well as the Empress of India. So does that change anything?
Well, I mean, so remember, Victoria was crowned in 1837. She comes to the throne. I mean, I would say that Victoria became sort of a touchstone for motivation for the British. She was really so charismatic. I mean, even though.
But there's a big gap though between coronation here and the becoming the Empress of India, right?
Well, that comes because of 1857.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason that there's the gap is because when the British take India, they now self-identify as an empire.
Yeah.
But certainly their positionality in the world and claiming to be an empire becomes one that is intended to garner respect and even consternation from others around the world. Yeah. And it worked.
And it works, and you know, this is the thing about it being real, and the thing about it being, it still affects or happening. I mean, my grandfather was alive when I remember as a child him telling me the stories of them being given mithai sweets at Queen Victoria. When she said, because he died he was 108 or 110 when he died, and he died in the 80s.
So that means he was around in the 1880s.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is when, of course, Victoria was still going strong. I mean, Victoria died in 1901. But the 1880s was a time when here in England, I mean, you had, some would argue, really the apogee of political power. You had, of course, Gladstone, you had Disraeli, Gladstone, Disraeli. And boy, hasn't British politics changed a little bit since that era? Can you imagine from Gladstone and Disraeli to Sunak and Starmer? But, you know, that's a whole different lecture, mind you. But this idea that if you think about the synergy, and if you think about now coming to terms with being the zeitgeist of the world, that has a multiplier effect. You don't want to then risk, even for a second, losing the momentum that you have. Yeah. And that keeps the British really focused on India and pushing forward. It's a matter of reputational and risk assessment than it is just simply about economics and politics.
And what can we learn from this then?
Wow.
And apart from the fact that obviously, you know, colonialism, not a good thing, but what can we learn from it?
Well, first of all, once upon a time, we could have gone ahead and said that, but even the notion of the merits of colonialism are being renegotiated.
Well, yeah.
So, but I think it's important. I mean, we can go ahead and say, well, you know, who would be on with that? But there are people who are on. I mean, you open the newspapers today, and I mean, people like Neil Ferguson and all will go ahead and still extol the virtues of colonialism for two reasons. One, of course, very selfishly, and then in sort of this backhandedly patronizing way of saying, well, I mean, look at what the British did for India. We may have, you know, stripped it of everything else, but look at the railway system. Yeah, but you took the trains with you when you left. So I don't know about the merits of that. What I do find, though, and the lessons that can be learned, number one, is that history is not static. And history is not just about analogies. In fact, I would say it shouldn't be about analogies. It's very easy for us to fall into the trap of saying, this is like this now. I find it to be far more interesting, instead of looking at history by analogy, looking at history by causality. What were the things that were happening at the time, or as I said when we hit rewind, going back in time, to say that this led up to the annexation? I mean, as I showed you, and hopefully showed you this morning, there were two wars that were occurring. Before that, there was ambition. Before that, there was also expansion on the part of the British East India Company. It's also important to recognize that these things now, of course, we have the luxury of looking back 175 years and longer in time. It may seem so abundantly clear and obvious. I mean, to the point where all of us have probably watched a match on TV or something and almost wanted to throw something at the TV saying, "Don't you see this happening? Don't you see this happening?" In the moment and at street level, it's not so easy. Moving from one decision to another may not appear to be as fateful as it then becomes. And the second thing is there's also this sort of human quality that even if something happens, we always think that we can reverse it or we can at least blunt it from how strong it is. The other thing I would say is watch out for the black swans. What about when Ranjit Singh dies and the kind of power struggle that was happening after that, the instability that it causes, and how that then is a factor in
well,
bringing
I was going
about...
to ask you about that, which is then obviously, does the Punjab that we have today, is that a creation effectively then of that annexation, in sense of what did they change, that how different would it have been to the Punjab that we ended up with in 47 or today even?
Well, which Punjab?
As a whole, as a whole.
Well, it isn't a whole.
It isn't a whole, yeah. Well, so you could say that's one thing that they...
That's exactly.
But in terms of the actual... So, for instance, my mum from Amritsar to Lahore, and my dad in Lahore, my best friend Lahore to I think Jalandhar, a Sikh guy going their way and my Muslim people going this way, so that we are products of it. And, at Christmas I was there, and you can still see where my auntie lives, you can still see the street signs in Sikh Punjabi rather than in Arabic script, which are remnants of pre-47. So that's today I'm sat here as a product of that kind of that partition, as you said. But the life on the ground that would have enabled that Sikh street sign in the heart of of Lahore itself, that would have been, I presume, created by the British Raj that after its annexation of the Punjab. So I suppose the point is to ask that question: how much did they change life on the ground, or did they effectively just allow it to, as you said, you alluded to it before, they allowed things to happen, but surely they must have engineered things over 100 or so years.
And I'm glad you used the word engineered, because they changed everything. I think the most important thing with the now injection of the British is not only the agency of the British, but the reduction, and in some cases the absence of agency of the people of the Punjab. So when you no longer have that kind of autonomy to make these decisions, and look, I mean, we all know people make bad decisions, but they are their own decisions. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons, because if they're your own mistakes, you can take ownership of them, but you also have then the agency to learn from them. If it comes from outside, then you are less familiar with how you got there. And it also becomes very easy to shift the blame completely to the outside force. And that's why if you're looking at this history, as I said, the British East India Company are certainly no saints. But when we're looking at it, hopefully through a certain kind of an objective lens, we're not placing a value judgment on the kinds of court intrigues of somebody dying and, the fact that it was an infant son who comes in. Let's say it wasn't an infant son. Let's say he came in as a fully grown adult. How would that go ahead and change the fact? Would it then have been a better way to deal with expanding the army so that the British East India Company would find it to be a deterrent from going in? Or was this an inevitability that the British would come sweep through? If a situation was different in Russia, if Russia wasn't seen as a threat to British interests in the area, then that whole area would perhaps not be of interest to the British, and all of these pieces on the board wouldn't have to be pushed around.
Okay, well, I think it's been fascinating. I can ask you a few more questions, but I think there's probably questions in the audience as
Yeah.
well.
I think we have a mic.
We've got a
roving
microphone,
around.
so if you just wait, there's a lady here right at the front, Libby. Doing it on purpose to make Libby walk all the way to the front. Yeah, if you just keep your hand up. Yeah, there you go. Right, thank you.
Hi. Is there any understanding of why, as I understand it, in 1857 in Delhi, after the mutiny, the British were struggling to retake Delhi, and that it was the Sikhs that came in and rescued them, essentially? Is there any understanding of why that happened from the Sikh point of view?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. I mean, part of the reasons why the Sikhs come into Delhi is because they find an opportunity for payback. I mean, quite simply. I mean, and that's the beauty of history, is that you realize that it is about opportunity, but it's also about some very, very deeply rooted human impulses. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, I mean, in 1857, as we all know, that's the end of the Mughal Empire as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Gentleman
That
here.
gentleman here, yeah.
One of the things William Dalrymple also mentioned was that the British has learned from the U.S. Revolution that they're not allowing people to own land in India, and so when they leave, yeah, they take the trains, but no one has any ownership, of personal ownership. Is that true? And if it is, does that affect the way? So, for example, in my home country, Indonesia, we still have disputes. The railway there, the railway company now, which is a state-owned company, still have disputes with some people who have papers that I own this station or something.
I'm still living that dream. Yeah, I've lost both my parents, and we are still sorting out my mum. My mum passed away 6-7 years ago. We're still sorting, because they were refugees from India to Pakistan. And the property they took over, there was no paperwork. It would have been a Sikh person's house who went to India. And so when my grandfather took over that house at some point, because that's what happened, he then eventually turned it into a market, because it's in the center of Lahore, and it's a big market. It's called Urdu Bazaar, where all the printing happens in Pakistan. And we have all these shops and everything and all these things. We have no bloody paperwork. You know, we got people paying couple of thousand rupees a month rent when it should be about 500,000 rupees because we've got no paperwork. So you're right, the reality is, yes, nothing existed for real people.
That is the saddest example of rent control I've ever
It's
heard.
terrible. Oxford University Press, don't put that in. They're one of the people making a fortune out of our property. But yes, it's the reality. Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I think whether it was done on purpose, I've no idea. But the thing that came with it was nobody had any paperwork. Yeah. All the paperwork has come in post. Yeah. You wouldn't even say in 47, even later.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, when you're talking about ownership and property and evidence of it, or the property itself just simply being confiscated. It's terrible because, I mean, this is generational property. I mean, it helps forge identity. It also can liberate.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not shackled by property and having to pursue it, arguably you then can move on. Yeah. And I think that this is one of the sad tragedies of the colonial project and its legacies, is that it has caused a kind of a schizophrenia among people who now are not just living in two worlds, but living in this idea of what do we do with something to hold on to.
Well, it's a beautiful thing because one of my friend, the Sikh friend I was talking about, his uncle was the head of the family and he was dying and he had one last wish, which was to go back to the ancestral home in Lahore. And he went back to the ancestral home in Lahore, knocked on the door with his son, and they explained who they were. They brought them in, they had dinner that night, he saw the house, came home, and he passed away within about 2 or 3 days. Because that yearning to see the house and then to be treated well, I think it was the end. He'd done everything that he needed to do. So there probably is something in that kind of, we may think of it as pieces of paper or bricks and mortar, but it means so much more to you, doesn't it?
Yeah. Look, I won't go back to any of the houses I used to live in the past in America because everyone's got a gun, so I don't have to.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised they didn't say, no, you're not coming in, it's not yours anymore. Any more questions?
Yeah, I think we have a couple more hands.
Yeah, Libby, we've got this gentleman here who's, yeah?
I have a comment and a question. So I think the comment about the railways is the biggest reason the British made the railways for India was to transport the raw material from the interiors of India, get them to the port of Bombay, and then ship them to the UK, and then bring the goods back fully processed, sell them at an exorbitant price in India. So they did that for their own good. It wasn't for they wanted the people to travel more freely. My question is when it comes to the Anglo-Sikh War, why have the historians used the term Anglo-Sikh? Why not Anglo-Punjab War? Because the rest of the wars were like with Tipu Sultan, it was the Anglo-Mysore War, or in the south there were the Carnatic Wars, or the Battle of Plassey, where it was against Siraj-ud-Dawla. So why is the Anglo-Sikh so common? Because I assume the whole of Punjab was fighting, even though under the banner of the Sikh leadership.
Yeah. That's a very good question. I'm glad that you asked it. In large part, it's because the territory was known as the Sikh Confederacy or the Sikh Misl. And so they were ascribing it to that more than trying to highlight the religious affiliation of that area. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think we have Libby. We have a question up here. This
I think there's a lady right at the front
and then the
here.
gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that history lesson.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm interested in is the connection between the annexation and the partition. As you said, my parents were both born in India, in Firozpur.
Yeah.
And we had to leave. And we were sent to Punjab in Pakistan. Till his dying day, my dad refused to acknowledge any kind of identity. He would say, I was born a British subject, I'm a British citizen. And he wouldn't they had these papers where you need to put your identity, he wouldn't do it. What I wanted to know was, what's the connection between annexation and the partition?
And thank you for the question, and I'm certainly very empathetic about what you're describing is really trauma, and part of that trauma is the dislocation of knowing who you are. How do you define yourself? And in short, that connection between the annexation of the Punjab to partition sets off a chain of events which ultimately culminates in partition. I wouldn't be so bold to say that the annexation of the Punjab was the reason that ultimately partition happened, because there's a lot of history and there's a lot of twists and turns that could happen, and things could have been different, a lot different. But when we're looking particularly at British involvement in India, the annexation of Punjab becomes very central, particularly because it leads to one of the major events, which is, of course, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. The same cannot be said about the Battle of Plassey, although, of course, very significant. The same cannot be said about the Battle of Mysore against Tipu Sultan, also significant. If we're looking at connecting dots, this one becomes a little bit more linear than what the other ones are.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question, it doesn't necessarily concern the Punjab of the last 200 years, it's more the Punjab of antiquity. And what I'm asking is essentially, from a military strategy point of view, why do you think Alexander the Great stopped when he reached Punjab? And why didn't he smash through?
I'm sorry, who?
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Yeah. Well, he smashes through to Kashmir, right?
He smashes through. Alexander. The question is about why did he stop there? I think he stopped a little bit before that. If you want to quote the famous line, it was that Alexander wept because he realized he had no more further worlds to conquer. Alexander was Macedonian, so for him, even reaching that far was, in his estimation, a long way from home. I could certainly find out from my classics colleague why Alexander didn't go further, but from what I understand,
It's the mutiny.
It was the mutiny that caused him to come back, and then of course he dies.
Yeah, it's the mutiny of the soldiers refused to go any further. I am probably a descendant of that. My family from Srinagar, and my DNA thing is on my dad's side 100% Mediterranean. So there you go.
Everybody from the region is going to claim one of two
Yeah.
ancestors. It's either Alexander or it's Genghis Khan.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to claim, but 100% is quite weird, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So have we probably got time for one last
Yep.
question? If we haven't, then no.
Any questions?
Any more questions? Well, then all that's left for me to say is that thank you very much to Said.